Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another chess opening, and this is the Nimzo Indian defense with the move 4e3. So, the Nimzo Indian defense with the move 4e3 will occur like this. White will go d4, black will play knight to f6, and now c4 by white. Black plays e6, and now white goes knight to c3. The move bishop to b4 will now be played, and we already have covered the moves a3 and queen c2, and we're going to be looking at a lot more other moves in the next video, which are basically the remaining moves, the sidelines for move number 4 for white. But for this opening, we're just going to be looking at what happens if e3 is played on move 4. Now, after e3 is played, black will play the move b6, and the idea is very simple. You want to fianchetto your bishop on b7, or if chance permits you to, you might even be thinking of playing the bishop out to a6 and eyeing the c4 pawn. So here, white has two main moves, both of them being bishop to d3 and knight ge2. And we're first going to be looking at the move knight ge2. And if knight ge2 is played, then black will just develop the bishop out to a6. And also, I want to point this out ahead of time. If the bishop goes to d3, you will play bishop to b7. So it just depends on the circumstances of the fifth move. The knight will come out to e2, the bishop goes out to a6, and here white has two different choices. Either playing the move a3, which kicks the bishop back, or forces it to take the knight on c3, or knight to g3, which is the more usual move you'll see. So if the move a3 is played, you're just going to take the knight on c3. The knight will recapture, as if you take with the pawn, the c4 pawn is going to be loose. So knight takes c3, d5, and now b3. Here black castles, white brings the bishop out to e2, and now the reason why it might seem very odd that you want to play the move d5 is because usually that will only favor white's pawn structure. In this case, however, white's pawns are not doubled, and it won't really matter whether or not black plays d5. So, with d5 in this case, after b3, why doesn't white instead take on d5? Well, that's because if the pawn is traded on d5, then it'll allow black to exchange their light-squared bishop for white's good bishop, meaning that white will essentially be left with a bad bishop, and it doesn't really go very well with the pawns that are now in the center, meaning the d4 pawn and the e3 pawn, because those pawns are dark squared pawns, and it's going to be really hard to actually develop the dark squared bishop for white. So black castles, white develops the bishop out to e2, and now a trade of pawns, and instead of playing bishop takes c4, which would just trade the light squared bishops off easily, b takes c4. Here, the black knight comes out to c6, and the idea is pretty obvious. You want to play knight to a5, and you will try to repeat the idea in the move for pawn to a3. Because in that opening video, you realize that black will play the knight to c6, and then to a5, which will later on attack the c4 pawn, and it'll give white a lot of problems to deal with. And the problem that white mainly faces here is that the a5 square is an outpost. You cannot kick this knight away with a pawn. And that's the main problem that white is facing in this variation. So a4, the knight goes to a5, not only blocking the advancement of the a pawn, but also now you're attacking c4. And although this bishop on c1 does have potential to get activated, that's not really the case that we're worrying about. We're just worrying about what the future for white's pawn on c4 is going to be. It's not going to be easy to defend the pawn on c4. In fact, there's only one real maneuver that actually helps out with this, and that's knight to b5, which blocks the bishop from attacking the c4 pawn. Any other move doesn't work because queen d3 will just allow bishop takes c4. So knight to b5, c6, knight to a3, and now the pawn advances to c5. And you give up the control of b5, but you realize that if c4 is extremely weak, then obviously you can have lots of potential of attacking it. In fact, taking the pawn on c5 could even allow black to develop the queen out to c7 rather than just trading the queens off. So mainly this position will be beneficial for black, although white does still have chances in this case. Instead of a3, you can also consider knight to g3, which will allow black to take the knight on c3 with check. Because now the pawns are going to be doubled. However, this is the reason why d5 is played in both variations, not just in the variations where the pawn structure is not doubled. So black will still play d5, and the idea is that you still want to trade off the light squared bishop, because if you trade off the light squared bishops, you're giving up your relatively decent bishop for a very active bishop that white has if it can be developed, and it'll really just mean that white will be left with a terrible dark squared bishop. So c takes d5 is one move here, and queen f3 and bishop to a3 are also moves to consider. If you play bishop to a3, then bishop takes c4. We have a trade on c4, and then there's a choice. You can either check on a4 and win the pawn back, or you can play e4 and just gain some central control. If queen a4 check, then just queen d7, you block. You offer a queen trade, and now if queen takes c4, then you still want to trade the queens off, and then just castle queenside, and there are ideas like e5 later on that can be played. Knight a5 is also an option because of how weak c4 is, and that is the idea of queen a4 check. If e4 instead, then just queen d7, you prevent the queen from checking on a4, and after castles, queen b5, queen a6 now, attacking the bishop. The queen comes out to c1, and now after knight bd7, rook d1, queenside castle. So this is just how black is going to try playing, just castle queenside, and potentially if black ever gets an opportunity to do this, maybe even bringing the rooks over to the g and h files can always create some sort of attack on the white king. So that was bishop to a3, and now we're going to be looking at the move queen to f3. And if this move is played, then white's just going to castle, and here there are two choices, either playing c takes d5 or e4. If c takes d5, we just take with the queen, e4, and gain more central control. And now the queen can come to a5 and defend the bishop, but not only that, also attack the c3 pawn. So it prevents moves like bishop to e3. And now, instead of playing the move c takes d5, white can also consider playing the move e4, which will allow d takes e4, knight takes e4, and now more trades, as there are always ideas against this rook on a8 because it's very vulnerable on this diagonal, and there's no pawn on b7 stopping the attack towards it. So knight takes e4, queen takes e4, and here, although you might be able to play something like knight to d7 and just develop your knight out, play knight to f6, although that is possible, instead it's a lot more interesting to play this move queen to d7. And this actually occurred in a game that Bobby Fischer played in 1966, and he used this very technique to beat his opponent. So bishop to a3, rook to e8, and now bishop to d3. Now the threat is queen takes h7 checkmate, but you're also threatening the rook on a8. So what is black going to do? Black might be lost, but there's this one move f5, which saves all of black's chances. Now it prevents checkmate, and now it kind of entices white to take the rook on a8. So the rook will be captured, knight c6, and the queen's trapped. So you obviously just don't want to give the queen up for no material, so queen takes e8, and queen takes e8. Now, white has two rooks against the queen. Is that enough compensation, though? No, it's not. The reason being that the c4 pawn is extremely weak, and white has so many targets that can so easily be attacked. And these two rooks, unless they're going to be willing to defend all of the targets, maybe white will not be able to hold on to all the material that they have, supposedly, for giving up the queen. So that was the move queen to f3. Now, there's also the option of just taking the pawn on d5, and if this were to occur, you just trade the bishops off. Queen takes d5, queen to d3, black castles, and now e4. White just gains more space in the center. The queen comes to a5, e5, and now knight to d5. Knight to e4, as playing a move like c4 to try kicking the knight back would either allow just queen to a6, pitting the pawn, or it could even allow the knight to maybe circle around from e7, and then you can always get ideas of c5 later on. So knight e4, pawn to f5, trying to kick the knight back. If you take en passant, then it won't really help you because it'll only open up your position more, and your king is really exposed if you think on terms of how safe it is and also how much development that you actually have. White does not have lots of development, so obviously their king is going to be very weak, and black has only the knight on b8 to worry about. White has to worry about the bishop on c1, the rook on a1, and also the rook on h1, so this is just not going to end well. Knight g5, attacking the pawn on e6, and now rook to e8. Defending it, and after bishop to d2, kicking the knight back with h6. Still, c4 cannot be played because there's queen to a6, so you must bring the knight back to f3. And here, the pawn comes up to c5. c4 will still allow either queen a6 or knight b4 here, so g3. And now you take on d4, white takes with the pawn, and queen to a6. You trade the queens off, you get loss of control of b4, and you just have more development than white, and you can easily use your pieces to sink into white's territory. White, on the other hand, can't quite do the same thing. So that was the move knight ge2 for white. The other option is to just play bishop to d3, which defends the pawn like this. It develops the bishop out and is now getting ready to play knight to f3. Bishop to b7 by black. And here, there are actually two options. White can either play knight to e2 or just play knight f3. Both develop this knight out, and if knight ge2, then the bishop will just take the pawn on g2, rook comes over to g1, bishop to f3, and this is the problem that white mainly faces. You see, if the rook takes on g7, then there's knight g4, and the rook is very, very cut off from the rest of the army. And the bigger problem is that now this rook is actually going to get trapped with a move like queen to f6. Trying to bail it out with something like h3, which tries to move the knight away from the g-file and essentially allow the rook to come back, will allow just a simple f5. And after f5, you have to take the knight, and now queen to f6. And this is already lost for white, because they're just going to be down in exchange. Thinking about other moves after bishop f3 won't quite work, because going something like rook to g3 would just allow bishop h5, and then the bishop comes to g6 to seal any sort of damage that the g-file has inflicted on it. So that was the move knight g2, and you can see that it's not really that impressive for black. Knight f3, however, can give white a bit more prospects, though. Both sides castle, and now c5 by black. The knight now comes over to a4. This is the main move. Another move is bishop to d2, which we're going to be looking at first. If this is played, then c takes d4, e takes d4, and now pawn to d5. You want to isolate the d4 pawn for white, and this will just give a better position for black. So c takes d5, knight takes d5, and here 4 moves have been tested out. The moves are queen to e2, knight takes d5, rook to c1, and knight to e5. If knight to e5 is played, then the knight will just come out to d7. You want to trade the knights off, and it'll just most likely give you an okay position, because you get rid of a powerful knight in the center, and later on your own pieces are going to be showing their true colors. So knight e5 is one move. Another choice is to go rook c1, which just reinforces the knight. If this is played, just avoid any trades, go knight back to f6. Reason being that if knight takes c3, b takes c3, the pawn is no longer going to be isolated. So you want to not really worry about trading off the pieces and allowing the pawn structure to be fixed. Rather, after a3 in this case, just bring the bishop back and just pile up on the d4 pawn. For instance, rook e1, knight c6, bishop f4, rook c8. Do not take the pawn on d4, as that would allow knight takes d4, and after queen takes d4, bishop h7 check. The bishop goes back to b1, and after knight a5, knight e5, knight c4. You want to trade the knights off. And does white really have any other option? Not quite, because b2 is going to be captured next if nothing is done. So knight c4, rook c4, and now bishop to e5. The rook back to c8. Now queen to d3, and the threat is to play bishop f6 and queen h7. g6 now, and now queen to h3. The queen circles around to try finding some sort of way to pry into the weaknesses that black's king has. The knight goes back to d7, and you obviously want to give your knight up for that bishop on e5, because it also reinforces the pawn on d4. So bishop to g3, the knight comes back to f6, and after this, there has been a game where this has been repeated a couple of times, and it eventually became a threefold repetition. The idea is just you have to keep your king very safe, and then in this specific case, d4 is extremely weak, so you might even get chances there. And in general, black has a very good game with an active bishop on b7. So instead of going rook c1, you can also think about maybe taking on d5, which allows bishop takes d2. And here, if white were to take the bishop back, regardless of whether it be with the knight or the queen, then queen takes d5 is playable, and, well, black gets an active queen in the center. So what is white going to try instead? White's going to play knight takes b6. Now attacking the rook on a8. The bishop on d2 is also attacked, but you also gain an extra pawn. So a takes b6. However, although it may seem like white has just won a pawn like that, he has to give it back up. The reason being that if you try to hold on to this d4 pawn with the move queen takes d2, then black has a very, very nice variation that will just simply win a good amount of compensation for the material. Can you spot it? Okay, the move is actually just bishop takes f3. And if g takes f3 now, there's rook to a5. You're not going to be worried about any sort of material disadvantage because, first of all, white's pawn structure is severely ruined. Secondly, there's a very weak pawn on d4, which is most likely going to be captured in a couple of moves, and you have no way of actually defending it. So rook d5 is the plan, knight c6 is a plan, and d4 is not going to be safe from any of this. And not only d4, but the king side is also completely open. So another plan that could be played is rook to h5, and then this queen coming out to h4. And you can already see where the targets are. So it's not going to be quite the best if you take on d2 with the queen, so you have to take with the knight. However, this allows the queen to get into d4, and there are no discoveries anymore because the knight is blocking the queen on d1. So this just gives black a pretty good advantage. Even if black does not really have a material disadvantage, positionally, his pieces are a lot better. And this knight getting into the action very soon with something like knight c6, maybe even knight d7, is going to maybe give black an extra advantage. So instead of knight takes d5, rook c1, or knight e5, you can also think of queen e2. Here you just develop your knight out. Knight at c6, and now after rook fd1, bring the bishop back to e7. Rook c1, and now rook c8. a3, you take on c3, and if b takes c3, you just lose the pawn on a3, so that can't work. Instead, bishop c3, and after knight b8, bishop e4. And the reason why you went knight b8 was because you wanted to bring this bishop to d5, and then develop the knight from behind. The knight comes out to e5, and now the knight places itself back on c6. Queen f3, and now f6. Knight takes c6. Taking on d5 with the bishop could also work, because after f takes e5, you can play bishop e6 check. However, instead of playing the move bishop takes d5, knight takes c6 also works. And after rook c6, rook e1, rook f7, bishop d5, queen d5, queen d5, e d5. This position is either a draw, or it could give black some slight advantage because the rook on c6 can infiltrate along the position, and maybe with doubled rooks this could also help. White's best bet is to probably play bishop to d2 and try trading these rooks off. And after that, there are still chances for both sides. So that was the move, bishop to d2. Instead, you could also consider knight to a4, which allows c takes d4, and now there are two choices. You can either play a3 or e takes d4. If a3 is played, then you just bring the bishop back to d6, not to e7, to d6, and the reason is that after ed4, you take the knight on f3, develop the knight on c6, and now you play e5. And the reason is because bishop d6 allows the defense of the e5 square. And after this e5 move is played, there's some tension going on along the pawns, and it's going to be very hard for white to resolve this type of conflict. The bishop is active, the knight's active. This knight on a4, however, for white is very misplaced, and with just a couple more developing moves, black should be very good in this position. So ed4 is another move. Rook e8, a3, bishop f8, b4, and this is a simple continuation. Bishop b2, and you just have to develop. Bring the queen over to b8, maybe double the rooks up. And after knight b3, e5, and after d e5, knight e5, knight a4, there's a threat on b6. So knight takes c4 will not work, as after bishop c4, rook c4, knight b6 will be played. So knight fd7, knight to d2, bishop c6, knight c3. And after knight f6, knight a4, knight back to d7. This is how the variation could end, maybe in a threefold repetition. Black just needs to find some way of developing the queen out. Maybe even the dark squared bishop could have some sort of prospects. But after this, black has chances overall, and so does white in some position like this. So that was the end of the variation, and I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.